Hey, welcome back to Ecommerce On Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Aaron, for those that are joining for the first time, do you want to give a quick overview of what Ecommerce On Tap is?
Yeah, so every week, Nathan and I pick a well-known, typically venture-backed or D2C company. This week, we're talking about Rhone. And what we're going to do is we're going to tell their founding story, reverse engineer their supply chain, talk about their exit potential.
Yeah, we have a lot of fun doing this. I mean, we've had some pretty incredible seasons in the past covering jewelry. This season, we're covering athleisure. So today we're covering Rhone, which is a activewear brand specializing in high performance men's apparel. They also expanded into women's recently, and they just emphasize innovation in their fabric technology and really cater to individuals that are both seeking functionality in their style, as well as kind of that blend of athletic wear. So before we dive into their founding story, I'm curious, were there any interesting tidbits that caught your eye the past week?
Yeah, I was paying a lot of attention to Shein. So, I feel like it feels like an eternity ago with all the tariff stuff. But they announced that they were going to IPO on the London Stock Exchange. Remember at the time that was kind of a big deal because it was the London Stock Exchange, not the U.S. Stock Exchange. And they've decided to pull their IPO. And at one point, they were looking for a valuation of about $90 billion. And as of February, just a few months ago, before the tariffs, they were looking for 30 billion, so quite a decrease in the valuation. So Shein was founded in China. They since moved their headquarters to Singapore, but they really just were this online sensation with this social media phenomena of really cheap clothing that comes direct from factories all around the world. And their business model obviously is extremely threatened by the tariffs, especially the decision to end de minimis, which happened this past week. And as a result, they've raised prices on some products by as much as 377%, which is hard to make a business on. And I think there was an analysis done by Bloomberg that showed that 100 of the top beauty products rose by 51% between April of 24 and April of 25. So they're definitely feeling the tariff impact. Similar to this, Temu also said that they're only going to start selling goods from local merchants to American consumers. And let me tell you, as someone who's living in Canada, I have never seen better deals on Temu than I have the last month or so, because they have all this excess stock that they produce for the U.S. market that they're kind of giving away in Canada. So it's been kind of fun selfishly for me, but obviously a lot of turmoil for a lot of other folks.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I mean, just to see how, you know, the tariffs have changed their business model pretty much overnight, especially with the de minimis rule change. And I mean, yeah, I can't imagine what's going on internally at both those companies, just given the current climate and everything happening. I mean, it seems like they still have markets outside of America, but I wonder what, portion of revenue was made up in America for them. And I assume it's a pretty big chunk.
Yeah, I saw something too where my wife sent me something where the amount of ad spend that Temu in particular had been spending has fallen off a cliff. And it was like, one of the top 5 apps that was downloaded for the last several years. And it's now dropped to like the 80s. And so, yeah, they're definitely pulling out of the US market. And I wouldn't be surprised if we hear about just dropping on the market completely, or at least some layoffs to try to right size the business.
Yeah, it's crazy. Crazy. What caught my eye is, I guess number one, Allbirds. It always fathoms, it just blows my mind how Allbirds, number one, is still putting up $200 million in revenue, which is awesome. But their stock is at an all-time low, about $40 million. And at the end of the year, last year, they had about 66 million in cash, but they're burning, close to 100 million, about 93 million a year. Um, and so it's just crazy to me that a company of this scale is burning that much money, and they continue to burn that much money if you look at their quarterly reporting, in Q1. And so it's just I don't know. What do you think is going on there? I mean,
Well, it's the worst $200 million you've ever heard of. I mean, it kind of doesn't matter because they're not profitable, and that's just a really really hard thing. Look, I know that team is doing the best they can. We did a deep dive on Allbirds a few seasons ago, and you know, I still believe that like what they were doing was the right thing, but just the execution has been very difficult, and so they are either going to have to you know be okay with being a smaller, profitable company and more of a niche player for people who want wool runners, or they're going to need to probably compromise some of those key principles that their current customer base is going to torture them for. So it's a hard thing for them for sure.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. I mean, my gut tells me they'll be delisted or taken private or something because I just don't see how they can sustain themselves as a public company. And that's
Going
what
private is
happened.
probably the best thing for them.
Totally. And that's actually what, recently happened to Solo Brands. So if you remember Solo Brands, they basically were a roll up fueled by Summit Partners that basically spent $300 million acquiring Solo Stove, Chubby's, Bora Kayak, and Isle. And it worked. I mean, when they went public, they were valued at $1.5 billion in 2021. And fast forward last week, they were delisted at a $3 million market cap. And Summit Partners still owns 70% of that business. And I mean, it's just, I think, brutal to see how this company's been treated in the public markets. Those brands are still putting up strong revenue numbers, but I guess a lot of public investors think they're over levered, they're not profitable, and they don't see kind of the sustainability of that basically holding company at this point because I don't know if someone that's buying Chubby's shorts is then going out and buying a Solo Stove and then buying out a kayak. I'm not sure what the blended customer mix is there, but it's a pretty brutal turnout, I think, for Summit Partners, considering that it looked like a huge success in 2021.
Yeah, you're right. Kind of when you put all those companies together, it kind of sounds like the perfect guys weekend. But there's a very limited number of people who are going for that. It's really interesting because each of those companies I think was interesting and it was good. I've known some folks at Chubby's for a little while, and the interesting thing is that when they IPO'd, their valuation was based off of an expectation of growth. And when that growth didn't materialize, the market switched and said, all right, we're not going to value on an expectation of profit. And they didn't have the profit to support it. And so I think it's a good example of potentially going public too early and not having the fundamentals in place where it makes sense that perhaps they should have stayed private longer, worked on getting profitable so that they could maybe come through at a maybe a lower valuation, but certainly something that could be sustainable.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, the shift from investors has really changed over the past few years. And, this is definitely a case of that. And, you know, I think there's staying power here, but, obviously with a different mindset and strategy. And we'll see what happens with Solo Brands. So kicking things off with Rhone, you want to give a quick overview for those that aren't familiar with Rhone in terms of what the brand stands for and how it was founded?
Yeah, I'm actually really excited for this episode. I've known of Rhone. I've known folks at Rhone, but I think I didn't really understand their story until we did the research for this episode. They're one of the most principled and mission-driven brands in the men's activewear space, kind of bar none. They did everything from threading silver into shirts to threading mental health into their mission. And Rhone has really carved out a niche that's performance focused, emotionally resonant, and just quietly premium. And so we're going to dive into some of these bold decisions that they took in their product design, their unique approach to marketing, and this high integrity buyback of El Caterton stake. So you don't hear about this so often where you have an investor who puts money in and then the founders say, you know what, we're going to actually buy that back from you. And so this is something that really allowed these founders to double down on their original vision. And I just think this is going to be a great story about what it looks like to scale without selling out.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I think one of the unique aspects of their founding story is they were founded by brothers, which I think is pretty cool and pretty amazing. I mean, getting to work with your brother, I think is awesome. So it started in 2014 by brothers Nate and Ben Checketts. The spark behind the company, though, started years earlier. Nate had actually spent time working in the NFL and at FanVision, where he saw firsthand how athletes and professionals obviously cared about performance, but didn't necessarily want to wear kind of gym branded clothing outside the locker room. And at Legends, where he was the strategic partnerships lead, he witnessed the explosion of these purpose driven brands. Ben, on the other hand, was a senior creative director. He had a deep love for storytelling and aesthetics, and he had previously worked on high profile creative teams and was really just in general very interested in men's mental health and personal development. And so I think the brothers had long talked about how few brands truly spoke to growth oriented men. And that's kind of where the thesis started from. I mean, Rhone was born from this question: where is the brand for the man who cares about performance, character, and confidence, but doesn't want to shout about it? And I mean, I think this is at its core a pretty strong concept, especially around 2014. But I mean, their story of really validating demand before they launched is pretty amazing. How do they go about validating demand?
Yeah, you're right. So Nate conducted over 100 customer interviews, or I guess potential customer interviews before they launched. And the idea wasn't to just build a better shirt. It was to try to build a better relationship between the consumer and their apparel. And so the goal was really function and feeling. That's something usually you just kind of sell one. So in the early 2010s, athleisure was already a market worth tens of billions. And Rhone saw this white space where Lululemon was focused on women, Nike chased youth, but nobody was really serving this reflective, purpose-driven man that they thought was a consumer out there. And so after they got a good enough signal from the market, they decided to go and launch Rhone. And they picked Rhone, the name. It's based after a European river that helps reflect endurance, natural beauty, timeless power. And they thought it was a metaphor for the type of man that they were building for. Before launching, they built this grassroots pre-launch email list just through their personal outreach. And that list ended up generating their first $80,000 in sales without a single dollar of paid ads. And so it's pretty remarkable. They started launching with premium pricing from the beginning, and they used this technology called Silver Tech, which we'll get to into a moment, which was really kind of high-end t-shirts. They had high-end commuter pants, and they wanted to establish the idea that Rhone wasn't another Me Too athleisure brand. It was really elevated performance wear. And so from the start, the brand was really designed to appeal to men in their 30s and 40s. So guys who had kind of outgrown the bro-y gym wear that's out there, but they still wanted to feel confident and technically equipped. And so it was really this idea, this very niche focus of luxury without ego, performance without hype, style without the trendiness. And the really, in comparison to some of the other brands that we've profiled, their goal was not to win the attention of influencers. It was really to earn the loyalty from professionals who valued design, mission, and practicality.
Yeah, I mean, pretty amazing to generate $80,000 off their email list, right off the bat. You say $70 price point, so they sold over 1,000, shirts basically, or pieces of clothing right off the bat from this email list. I mean, that really sticks out to me because I feel like that's market fit kind of right off the bat, right? They didn't have to rely on paid ads from the get-go. They kind of built this grassroots community through an email list that drove $80,000 in sales. I mean, I feel like that's validation right there, right? I mean, that would kind of prove to me, okay, there's something here. People are buying this. There's a high conversion rate off my email list. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and you think about building an email list is probably one of the harder things to do. I mean, it's easy to get names and emails, but to get people who are actually going to buy, who are actually going to provide that feedback is pretty interesting. From a brand perspective, how important is it that your first product is a mission signal, not just another SKU?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think they, especially at Rhone, stood true to their original ethos and wanted to create this blend where, people that are athletic and wanted confidence could wear something out of the gym as well. And I mean, they obviously did that just based on the sales from their initial product. So they focused on that and honed in on initial products that align with that. I think one of the challenges when you're starting with a higher end price point and product like that is, how do you build a premium product from day one with bloating your cost structure, especially when, your order quantity is probably not that high. You have any workarounds with that, Aaron?
Well, when from an operations perspective, if you're going to launch as a premium product, you kind of have to be perfect, right? If you're charging $10 for a t-shirt, you're going to have a different expectation of quality, of speed, of customer service than if you're charging $150 for that t-shirt. And so I think that it really comes down to one, recognizing that you're probably going to grow slower because there's just fewer people that are going to be able to afford that. But you've got to be responsive. And so you might still be staffing a customer service team that is just as big as a faster growing company, but it's really going to be about the quality of the interaction because each of those customers is precious, and there may only be 10,000 total customers that you can have in that first couple of years that you're going to go through. And so I think it's being very intentional. It's about working and growing slower, not only just after you've launched, before you launch, to make sure you've got the best experience, the best product you could put together in order to push it forward.
Yeah, and I think that also stems from, functionally they had superior fabrics, right? So from day one, they started with this silver tech fabric that basically embedded a silver thread into the fabric to eliminate odor. And it was kind of this nod to military grade performance gear. And that was an early brand pillar for them, was it was gear that performed over time, not just in the gym. I hadn't heard of silver tech before this, before Rhone. I don't know if you had. Is silver tech more of a marketing gimmick, or is there actually science behind this?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. There's actually science behind this. So the silver tech works through what's called ion release. And so actually little silver ions, bits of silver, are released over time, and that inhibits the growth of odor causing bacteria. It does it by breaking down their cell walls. And so Rhone used this approach to create performance garments that they promised would stay fresher for longer. That was kind of the product promise that they made. And there's a few different ways that companies have gone about integrating silver into fabric. The first one is yarn level infusion. So this is where they're going to take silver and permanently bond it into the yarn fibers during the manufacturing stage. This is something that makes it very durable. It can last hundreds of washes. It's the most advanced, it's the most expensive method to do it. And so that's actually what Rhone ended up doing. There are other alternatives. There's surface coating, which is where you take silver particles and apply them post-production, kind of think of a spray-on. Less durable, but much easier to scale. And then there's polymer embedding. So this is where you take silver and embed it into the synthetic polymer mix, the recipe, if you will, that goes to make the yarn. And then that's spun out. And this helps balance the longevity and the performance. But like I mentioned, Rhone really wanted to lean in, and they opted for this permanent infusion at the yarn level. It was definitely more expensive, but it also was more high quality. And it like we're talking about, it aligned with their premium positioning. And so this allowed their shirts to remain odor resistant for over 100 washes, far beyond industry norms. And so for them, this wasn't just about better smelling gym wear. It was really a brand signal. And Rhone really wanted to build products that could go from a workout to a meeting without a wardrobe change. Although I don't know if I would want to do that even if my clothes were fresh. But it was really something that, this technical performance could be elegance. That's what they leaned into with the Silver Tech.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how they started with the silver tech methodology and how they've really kind of kept that at its core nowadays. And I think the past few years, there's been some environmental concerns around nanoplastics that have been released from silver tech, especially around treatment like this. They, as I saw, kind of sought to address this actually by pivoting to gold fusion,
Yeah,
which
well, what's
is
better than silver? Gold, right?
yeah, exactly. I know. And so this is an alternative that basically involves now embedding gold particles, specifically ionic gold, into the fabric at the molecular level using a water-based infusion process. And so, I wasn't familiar with silver tech, definitely not familiar with gold fusion, but from my, research, it's unlike traditional coatings that wash out over time. The gold fusion actually binds the particles directly to the yarn, which maintains performance through repeated use. And so it has, I guess the gold has similar antimicrobial properties to silver, but it's less controversial from an environmental perspective. It also resists odor buildup by disrupting bacterial cell walls, similar to the silver ion technology in silver tech. And the manufacturing process is designed to be eco-friendly with no harmful solvents or residual chemicals. And so, similar to silver tech, there's different ways of manufacturing this type of material. There's spray coating, there's bath infusion, and there's yarn level integration. And so, Rhone uses yarn level integration with their gold fusion, which is supposed to maximize durability and ensure the performance properties are baked in the fabric, not just layered on top. So, I think over time, obviously microplastics has become a real concern for a lot of people. And it seems like the silver tech, maybe had some nanoplastics that were being released that could cause harm to the environment. And I think this is kind of what led to Rhone deciding to have shirts laced with gold.
Yeah, laced with gold is a good way to put it. And What's interesting about this is that they initially went out and said, "Hey, we want to have something that is going to solve the odor problem," and the silver tech stuff worked. Right? It is very valid in there, but again, they were aspirational. They wanted to be premium. Part of being premium is that you try to be the best, and so they raised the stakes and went to this Gold Fusion piece, and it's really become both a technical as well as a storytelling upgrade. And so it's something that really positioned Rhone as a forward-thinking innovator, not just reacting to concerns about silver, but proactively seeking a cleaner, more scalable solution for long-term use. And when you've got this material that's infused with these gold particles, it's maintaining that odor fighting performance while still offering greater sustainability. So it's a win-win. And so this wasn't just about chemistry; it was about branding. And Gold Fusion became part of their identity because it was a proprietary thing that they helped develop. And so Rhone's Gold Fusion tech has been lab tested to last over 100 washes with zero odor retention. And so most athletic brands stop the innovation at the fit. They really start with chemistry, which is something that you normally don't see.
Yeah, and so it wasn't just another tee; it was basically a tech platform disguised as apparel in some
Yeah.
sense, right? I mean, they really tried to innovate from the fabric level, and their first breakout product was actually the commuter shirt. It basically looked like a dress shirt but performed like activewear. And Nate, one of the co-founders, famously ran the London Marathon wearing it, sweating through 26.2 miles in a crisp, wrinkle-free button down, which became the brand's calling card for form meets function. I don't know if I would ever run a marathon in a dress shirt, or I've never even ran a marathon. I ran a half, but I mean, let's be honest. Would you run a marathon in a dress shirt?
No, absolutely not. So I think it's brilliant, though. I mean, who else turns performance wear into a proof point like that? And so the fact that they ran a marathon in a button down, made it a PR event, it was absolute genius. And so that's really proof of their concept, not just a pitch.
Yeah, and they had these different, hidden affirmational tags like "Don't die without a few scars" or "Forever forward," and I think that helped add emotional stickiness to their products. They weren't just, necessarily loud slogans; they were meant to be personal mantras sewn into the seams of their clothing. And the affirmations, it's not just marketing fluff. I think it's actually how you build a core emotional feeling into something that's functional, right? I mean,
Yeah.
to number one, think about running a marathon in a dress shirt. You wouldn't even think about that before Rhone did it, right? And so I think that kind of stems from, building emotion and function into their products.
Well, it's also like a little Easter egg, right? Because I'm wearing a shirt today. I couldn't tell you where I got the shirt, what brand it is. I know I like the shirt, but they've got these affirmations that are sewn into the actual product. So maybe 1 out of 5 times you're saying like, oh, there's a nice pick me up about don't die without having a couple scars, and so it does connect the brand on a more regular basis versus just, hey, what am I wearing today?
Right. And I think they've done this in a strategic way, right? So if you look at where Rowan has grown in the activewear space, last episode we covered Gymshark, right? And they started from one of the biggest fitness conferences in the UK when they were getting their story started. And Rowan has leaned in over time to physical retail experiments as well. So their Walden house was a mobile pop-up. It was a Scandinavian style tiny house that toured the US, allowing them to test new geographies without committing to long leases. Thought was a very innovative strategy. And then I've been to a few Equinoxes, and I've actually seen kind of just Rhone clothing all over the Equinox, little shop that they have. And Equinox is this kind of premium gym that, so many people across major cities go to. And I think it really gave Rhone an exposure, a key exposure point to affluent, health conscious men in the exact right demographic, really connecting with Equinox members there. So while competitors like Viore leaned into the West Coast lifestyle and Gymshark went, full throttle on Gen Z with their influencer marketing, Rhone really held firm on its minimalist identity and, modern high performance activewear that I think stemmed in large part due to this Equinox partnership.
Yeah, it's kind of a perfect thing there because it just goes to show you that the right retail distribution, even if it's smaller, trumps retail distribution in general. I mean, imagine if Rome tried to show up at an Aldi, right? or at an odd lots or something that, a discount retailer, that would completely change their purpose. But the fact that they're like, hey, this is stuff that you could buy right here, go, to a business meeting, and it's the right demographic. I mean, it's just a brilliant masterstroke.
Yeah, and I think, we talk about silver tech and gold fusion, and what comes to my mind from a supply chain perspective is how hard is it to pull off this kind of performance textile innovation, right? Is it scalable? Does it only work at a certain volume? What actually goes into that from a supply chain perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know. I know that Gold Tech is a proprietary piece that Rhone has. I don't know to what extent they said, hey, let's go hire some scientists and just do basic research to figure out if this works. Typically, the way this works is that these contract manufacturers who they're using, who are producing everything, they have these ideas, these products, these things. And a lot of it comes down to being the company that's willing to give it a chance, right? So it's something where you see that it's much more expensive. You see that there's those proof points, and so it's always going to be smaller volume because that's kind of where these innovations start. But eventually, you get to a point where the scale can be there, and you can scale with that contract manufacturing. So I think that it's more about the brand having an appetite to try something that may be more expensive and may not entirely work out because you think it gives you an edge.
Yeah, I agree. And I think too, Roan really used mental health as a brand pillar as well. So not just the fabric technology, but their slogan, Forever Forward, they say wasn't just a tagline, it was a philosophy for self-improvement and resilience. And as Ben described, it wasn't just an afterthought. They've kind of always been fascinated by the internal journey that men go through around confidence, identity, and just how do you show out for yourself and your people. And so I think this brand voice really spoke to growth, not grind. And they conducted a lot of customer surveys that showed that 67% of their Gen X and millennial men cared about mental health, but only 12% say that brands talk about it authentically. And so Roan really tried to step into that void. And I kind of was wondering, is this a real kind of mental health as a business strategy, or is this a gimmick? Where do you think this lines when it comes to where Roan stands here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the separation between a gimmick and a business strategy is how authentic are you? I mean, I can just tell in my own life, over the last 5 to 10 years, it has become more acceptable to talk about mental health, right? To some extent, people have always said, oh, I need a mental health break, haha. But, really actually talking about it and understanding that, hey, I'm going through a hard time. This isn't something that I can just muddle through. I need to work through some things. I need to talk to someone. That has become more normalized in a way that it hasn't in the maybe 20 years prior. And so I think that to that extent where they were really trying to be authentic, that's where it becomes part of their strategy. And some of the proof points for that authenticity come to the Pursuit, right, which was an editorial platform that they launched, and it has essays, it has interviews, it has mental health resources that kind of sat along their product pages. And so this wasn't as if they said, "Here's our site, go buy our stuff here," and then over here, buried underneath page 10 of something, there's a blurb about mental health that says we do it, but they interspersed it, right? You couldn't buy a product without going through and seeing some stuff, or at least being invited to see some stuff about mental health. And so it wasn't designed to drive SEO. It was really designed to create alignment. They wanted to find consumers and partners that really valued mental health as uh, something that was important to them versus just buying a shirt. I think it's really interesting is this Kevin Love partnership they did. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I love this Kevin Love partnership. I thought it was really well done. And for those that don't know, Kevin Love is a NBA All Star who really is a voice for mental health. And so they partnered with Kevin Love, and they started this mental healthy capsule drop that was paired with fundraising for mental health nonprofits. And I thought it really evoked positivity and great storytelling, and just that they were able to have such a big name around mental health, Kevin Love, be a part of it, I thought was a huge move for Roan. And I think it wasn't a press stunt. I think it was one of the first times that we saw a men's brand, lead with this type of voice. And I thought it was very well done. I'm curious, what was your takeaway from the partnership?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the fact that if you haven't seen the piece, you guys should go look it up on YouTube. It's very interesting, and I think it's really about someone being authentic, being very vulnerable, which is something you normally don't see from, well, just people in general. And so I think it was very strategic. It helps create a moat around something that isn't product or price. It's really this trust they're trying to build. And I think that their apparel was really something that felt like wellness gear without screaming it. And so this slightly subtle approach that consumers discover is their ethos rather than being preached to and about, hey, you should be better, right? And
Yeah, I
so
thought it was great because typically like Gymshark, for example, right? A lot of that is around physical transformation in terms of how their brand speaks to their consumers, whereas Rhone really leaned into this kind of emotional transformation, and I think the result was higher retention, stronger word of mouth, and really creating a different audience that couldn't be copied with margins alone. And so Rhone didn't just talk about values; they built systems to deliver them through these partnerships, through these different growth avenues. And I think they offered something deeper, emotional support in the form of thoughtful products that, through this season of e-commerce on tap, we haven't quite seen a brand do this to the extent that Rhone has. And I think it's authentic, right? I think it really, speaks true to a lot of men. And I think that's why they've had a lot of success.
I completely agree. And I kind of am picking up the same trend that you're noticing is that if you look at the companies that we've profiled so far, Aloe, Gymshark, Rhone, and we've got several more athleisure ones coming up in the next couple of months. Um, they all come from the same factories, more or less, but their brands couldn't be more different. And so I think this is a great masterclass in terms of what it looks like to actually build a brand and how do you become different, even if the underlying product could be, argued is relatively the same. Let's talk a little bit about the financial milestones of the business. So what do we know?
Yeah. So what we were able to pull out from our research is, 2014, the company was founded. They did $80,000 in sales from their email list, no paid ads. 2017, they get an investment from L. Catterton, which takes a very large but minority stake to fuel growth. 2020, it's estimated they crossed 50 million in revenue. 2022, a really unique point is the founders actually buy back the L. Catterton stake via a SPV, a special purpose vehicle, with new strategic investors. 2023, Rhone becomes profitable, surpasses $100 million in revenue. 2024, they launched their women's line. They expand their board with Tess Roaring and Jimmy Piacero. And they, really have this kind of goal of reaching a 50-50 gender split by 2027. And according to E1 funding rounds, we're estimated to value the company about 350-ish million in 2024. So to me, I mean, number one, their growth is amazing. I think they really speak to the consumers. But what stuck out kind of the most was actually this buyback from L. Catterton, right? I mean, we rarely see that happen. I think it's one of the most interesting parts of this story now.
I've never seen this. I don't know about you, but the fact that someone says to an investor, "Hey, appreciate what you've done, but we actually want to buy your stake out and part as friends," is completely unheard of, at least in my book. And so let's kind of dive into this a little bit more. So in 2017, L. Catterton, which if you don't know L. Catterton, you know their brands. They're a very prominent consumer-focused private equity firm. They took this minority stake in Rhone. And it was a very strategic move, right? It was capital scale, it was credibility from a well-known backer. But over the years, Rhone's leadership began to sense a misalignment in the values or the goals. So L. Catterton wanted a faster exit timeline. They were looking at Lululemon. They were looking at Aloe, which during this same time period had grown to, I think, $1 billion in revenue. And so they wanted to kind of get their investment, get in, get out, and push for growth. But the team at Rhone really wanted to build slowly. They wanted to build more intentionally. And it was important that they had long-term integrity, especially around the purposes of mental health, which you could argue could be set to the side in hopes of chasing higher growth. And so, having this disagreement among investors isn't uncommon. But what is uncommon is the fact that Rhone sought a way to resolve it. and what had to be true about both sides in order to make this possible.
Yeah, so I looked up, and it turns out so only 1% of PE-backed brands ever buy back their own equity. So, Rhone is part of that 1%, which is pretty wild. It's like you
They
said,
probably are the 1%,
yeah,
honestly.
yeah. So, like you said, it's almost unheard of. But I think what makes sense here is that rather than grind toward an unwanted exit or dilute the brand by, growing too fast, the founders made a rare move and bought back El Cataton's 29% stake through an SPV. And so I think, kind of they went about this in a very smooth and strategic way, right? Because John Owsley of El Cataton remains on the board, showing mutual respect and a long-term partnership. And so instead of a PE stake, Rhone actually brought in a curated list of angels in this SPV. So, for example, they brought in David Blitzer, who owns multiple sports teams. They brought in Gabe Plotkin, a hedge fund exec, and they brought in Steve Young, the NFL Hall of Famer, as well as Tim Tebow. And so I think they wanted more strategic investors here that could align with them for the long term. And they represented Rhone's ethos, right? They brought credibility, discipline, and a lot of values that align with the brand long term. And so this allowed them to continue to scale the original mission at their own pace, right? Like you said, El Cataton has a certain exit timeline they want to hit that didn't align with Rhone at the time. And that I think is really why Rhone decided to buy back these shares. And it's I think a masterclass in cap table governance to, number one, keep that original investor on the board, shows mutual respect and alignment. But number two, to be able to pull off a move with these strategic angels is pretty incredible.
It really is. A lot of founders talk about values. Rhone bought theirs back. And so I've never, like you said, I've never seen a cleaner example of what I would call values-based restructuring. And this is the business equivalent of doubling down on your principles. And it's just, as I was reading this and preparing, it's just like, wow, wow, wow. The fact that El Cataton was willing to, both sides were willing to recognize that, like, hey, we want different things, and that's okay. And so then they said, okay, rather than fighting about it and having a winner and a loser, can we find a way where both sides can exit and win? And I'm sure that El Cataton got to mark up and they made a decent amount on their side. I doubt if they gave them $30 million, so they made $30 million, they probably got 50 or 60. Of course, I'm making up both those numbers, but it's just really interesting, and I find it so fascinating that the circumstances and the people and the maturity all came together to allow them to do what they want to do, which in Rhone's case was to grow more slowly, to grow more intentionally, which is antithetical to most VC-backed businesses.
Yeah, it's just incredible. And I mean, if you look at their story, this definitely stands out in terms of the buyback. What else stands out to me is their supply chain. Obviously from Sourcify and ISBA, we dive deep on supply chains every day. And Rhone's supply chain is pretty spectacular, right? So their supply chain was built for flexibility, innovation, and operational discipline. I thought one unique characteristic was over 85% of Rhone's factories met third-party sustainability or social compliance standards. And that's pretty uncommon for DTC brands under $150 million in revenue. They partner with RAP certified factories across Vietnam, China, Indonesia, Thailand, and Italy. And Gold Fusion, which was their proprietary fabric treatment that we discussed earlier, required developing a new chemical process and safe handling protocols in their production line, which, obviously is a major barrier to copycats. And I think one early example is, remember that commuter shirt that Ben ran that marathon in? It was, this kind of fabric that they developed alongside an Italian mill to develop this unique stretch fabric that could hold shape like a dress shirt, but stretch and breathe like a performance tee. And that really, the commuter shirt was kind of the breakout piece of apparel. And so I think in general, premium brands have higher consumer expectations around experience and speed, but demand and managing a supply chain can always be a challenge. How did they manage these elements from a logistics standpoint?
Yeah, again, like you said, when you're a premium brand, you have premium expectations, and so but they also didn't have a lot of money, and so their early logistics model really emphasized lean inventory, and they worked on shorter production runs, rapid reorder windows, flexible warehousing, all those sorts of things. So it was probably more important for them to take the risk of stocking out as opposed to sinking too much cash into inventory early on. Their packaging was also an element that kind of spoke to this premium positioning, and it evolved right alongside the product. So we're talking recycled mailers, biodegradable plastic alternatives, FSC certified hang tags, and really just this very clear shift to low impact materials.
Yeah, and I think too, the way that they expanded into retail is pretty insightful, right? We talked about the testing that they did with the pop-up stores that they had, and then really their first kind of physical footprint came from their Equinox partnership, which I thought was a masterclass in retail expansion, right? Why not use a partner that has an audience you want, that's, going in and out of these gyms all day long, and have some, incredible brand placement in there. And so they had real time customer feedback loops within the gym. And Equinox was really the perfect Trojan horse for them to dip their toe into physical spaces. And they scaled that strategy with data, only opening stores where customer density and brand familiarity were high. And I think this helped avoid overexpansion that, oftentimes hurts D2C peers. And so while a lot of other companies, overbuilt physical retail, Rhone really focused in on this density and high value health conscious metro areas. By 2023, they had 16 stores. And I think used learnings from these partnerships to inform physical site selection. And they wanted a lean, data driven approach. And their store interiors really mirrored their brand tone, right? It's quiet, it's clean, it's modern, it's, kind of very aesthetic
It's
looking.
not Abercrombie.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I want to kind of double click on this partnership with Equinox, right? Number one, how do you think that was structured? Was Equinox just buying Rhone clothing and putting it in their store at wholesale prices? Was there consignment here? I mean, how do you think they structured that? And number two, this seems like a great strategy that more brands should lean into in terms of using gyms or co-working spaces or niche venues as first retail partners instead of going out and opening their own stores.
Yeah, I think the key thing here is that the right retail distribution trumps everything. And I think that you define right in a couple different ways. The first one is this a brand awareness play? Is this a marketing play? Right? And is it something where we just want people to get experience or exposure to Rhone? Or is this something where, look, we need to make as much money as possible, and so it's going to be bigger there? I would imagine, I don't have any inside information, but I would imagine that this was such a strategic move that it was a coup for Rhone to get into Equinox. And I'm sure there was consignment. I'm sure that there was, reduced margins, things like that they could do because they saw this as a marketing channel that was going to, someone says, oh, wow, this shirt's really cool. What else do they have? Oh, wow, they've got pants, they've got shorts, other t-shirts, things like that. And so that's the way I look at it. And so my advice to any brand who's thinking about this is to try to really think about what channels are the most important. It's not about just chasing Target and Walmart, unless those are where your consumers are. But you're probably not going to get there right after you launch. And so being able to find the right partner and giving them any deal that makes sense is something I think most people should emulate.
Totally. I agree. When it comes to their exit now, they control their own destiny, right? They don't feel pressure from, a PE firm on their cap table. They really have a ton of open options here. Obviously one of the takeaways that I had, they mentioned that they want to expand into the women's category very strongly, right? They want a 50-50 gender split of their customers. And so I think that's something they really have to do to double their TAM and something that they're working towards. What do you think from, an actual exit standpoint? What do you estimate timeline to potentially be? Any strategics that come to mind for you?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think that they're naturally entering an exit window where people are going to come ask questions and put things up there. So you could have a strategic acquirer, someone like VF Corp, LVMH, New Guards Group. So these folks that are focused on that premium lifestyle conglomerate. You could see a PE roll up of other mission-led brands or those sorts of things. But I think the most likely outcome here is that they continue to run this as an independent company for a long time. They're profitable. They've got a mission that they seem to be really loving and making a difference in. And so I think that's really what they're going to stick with.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, key strengths that stuck out to me were a loyal customer base. Like you said, their clean cap table, they're mission driven. I mean, I just love this story, right? There has been, I think, very few brands that we've covered that, number one, have had the strategic expansion to retail. Number two, had a really, tech focused when it came to their fabrics. And number three, probably the only brand that we've covered that had actually a buyback or buyout, or yeah, buyback of their shares from a PE group. And so it's been a very unique look at a very different brand. How do you think listeners should really think about this episode?
Yeah, so for me, we should look at Rhone as more than just a performance brand. It's really this blueprint for a mission driven growth with operational discipline. And they show that you don't have to choose between performance and purpose or between scale and soul. Now, that growth may come at a slower clip than other brands or other people. But from this silver tech to gold fusion, from the affirmational messages that are in the seams, their story is really one of deliberate decisions and just reinforcing this consistent identity. So it really does speak to the power of brand, the power of having a core message that you don't deviate from. And if you make that bet and you say this is who we think our consumer is and this is who we want to serve, and you just live and feel that and try to build products and experiences around that, you can grow, right? It may not be at 200% month over month, but there's a business to be had there.
Yeah, and I think
But yeah,
too, what stood out to me is that you can't be afraid to make bold course corrections when your cap table or your partners no longer match your mission. I mean, it was very, very bold for Nate and Ben to go out and say, "Hey, we're actually going to buy back our shares from our PE investor from El Caterton," right? And I think that was a big, bold move that they did. And now, look, they control their destiny. They can do what they want in the future, and I think that's the beauty of that bold decision. Number two, they really built brand equity, not just through product, but through values, tone, and long term community engagement. And they use kind of these, retail partnerships as a proving ground, not a vanity project. They had this kind of show, don't tell mentality. I mean, if you look up the marathon stunt that they did with, running a marathon in a dress shirt, I mean, that's thinking outside the box. And that's what you have to do with that startup mentality and as a upstart brand. And they stayed small enough to listen, but I think bold enough to lead. Rhone grew slowly, in comparison to some of the other athleisure brands that we've covered, like Gymshark, but they grew intentionally, which I think gave them the scale, gave them the freedom to scale in the way that they wanted. So, I mean, I'm curious, right? If you were advising a brand today, what's kind of one of Rhone's playbooks that you tell them to copy or take from?
that's a good question. I think that my biggest takeaway is that values aren't just positioning. They're really decisions you have to make again and again and again, even when they're expensive. And so that's really something that I really appreciate about the founders, about the story, and it's something I think more brands should try to copy.
I agree. I love that. I love this story. For those, still with us here on E-commerce on Tap, we need you to do one thing right now. One thing for us. Share E-commerce on Tap with a friend and leave a review. We appreciate you tuning in. This has been a magnificent story of Rhone, brought to you by E-commerce on Tap, Sourcify, and ISBA. We are here for all your supply chain challenges. We know there's so much going on with tariffs and figuring out how to navigate them. Aaron and I are here to help. I think we've both gotten so many different phone calls over the past few weeks, but we are always here to chat with founders that need any supply chain help or need help navigating these tariffs. And leave a review and share with a friend. And we will see you next time on E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA.